Imagine that we could connect to much broader sensory input. So imagine we were sort of a community that had sort of telepathic communication. One of the things that's true is we don't know what the heck to do with all of that data, because most of our world is used to the experience we have of vision and hearing and so on, the limited data that we get into our sensory systems. By the time you're sort of accumulating tons more data about the world, it's not something that we are intrinsically built to deal with. And we could sort of just plug in, what will we make of all of that? There is structure, you will find some. There are regularities to be found, which an ordinary human brain has a very hard time finding. Language is intrinsically a quite societal kind of construct. In other words, the fact that I'm saying a bunch of words and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I learnt those words when I was very young, and I learnt them from other humans, and now I'm using those words to communicate with other humans. The case of words is that they're kind of this social construct that allows for communication between different people. So I'm not even sure that, if you have this completely different sensory experience, do you form, unless you have something to talk to that's had similar sensory experience, I'm not even sure what words you form. And I think it's the same type of thing. When you have a big system, you have these subsystems, whether it's in biology or in systems engineering, you have these subsystems that have these sort of APIs, these connections that are somehow limited. Now, somehow those connections are a little bit like languages, a limited number of kind of symbolic concepts, which you are then communicating to other subsystems. You're using this kind of thinner communication channel between subsystems, and you're using that as a way to organize the whole system rather than having everything communicate with everything. But even sort of biology has done that at all scales, whether one's dealing with cells, whether one's dealing with organisms that interact with the whole sort of species and ecosystem and so on. It seems to kind of at all levels have this kind of approach where sort of a cell is something that has a limited kind of set of ways in which it communicates with other systems. And I think it's sort of a question of when those components are organized, how are they organized, and how complicated can their sort of APIs, their connections, how big that interface can be. Eddie is commenting that creatures like cuttlefish and octopus must have something different going on in their brains, because they can do things like mimic the outside world with their color and texture and so on. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I was talking to an expert in cuttlefish, etc., perception recently. Yeah, I mean, this whole question, RBS is commenting, in the future the Earth will probably be a big brain. Yeah, I mean, this whole question about the organization of humans with cells and neurons in our brains, and that builds up to a whole brain that has a whole unified idea of what's going on, and then you build up to human society. Does human society have a unified idea of what's going on? I don't know. As individuals in that society, you might say, no, it doesn't. But looked at from the outside, you might say, well, society is deciding to go in this direction. Just like, in a sense, if you could query our individual neurons in our brains, they wouldn't have a coherent idea, probably, of what's going on. That's something that builds up in the collective, so to speak.